Degrowth, broadly defined, is the academic framework and activist movement that presupposes that infinite economic growth on a planet with finite resources is both impossible and disastrous. Therefore, people who advocate for degrowth, or degrowthers, seek to reduce the material throughput of the economy, specifically the economies of rich and industrialized countries, while simultaneously cultivating socioecological well-being within and beyond the human world at the intimate, collective, and global scales. Through research and practice, the degrowth movement seeks to create the social and material conditions in which all beings have the means to live a good, dignified, and meaningful life. Due to degrowth's Eurocentric origins and relative nascency as an academic movement, however, there is a dearth of literature that takes an autoethnographic approach to understanding degrowth from an American perspective. Therefore, in this performative autoethnography, I will unpack my lived experiences as a degrowther with my positionality, especially in the context of contemporary times. More precisely, I will lay bare my thoughts and feelings about being a young, queer, Filipino-American Ivy League graduate student who aligns himself with struggles for socioecological well-being, all during a time of immense social upheaval and ecological breakdown. Taking inspiration from Denzin's call for creative forms of scholarship, drawing upon dramaturgical sociological concepts such as Goffman's appearance and manner in Hogan's exhibition, and utilizing my background as a classically trained actor and experienced videographer, this project will take the form of a video in order to reveal deeper autoethnographic insights that might only be gleaned via the video medium. That was what I sent in on October 8th, 2020 as the abstract for my final research project for a course taught by Professor Guobin Yang at the University of Pennsylvania's Annenberg School for Communication. The course, entitled The Performance Society, Social and Media Theories, centers around the theories and frameworks that understand social reality through the lens of performance. As someone with over a decade of experience in the theatrical art form, a high school diploma from a performing and visual arts high school, a Bachelor of Fine Arts in acting from a reputed collegiate training program, and a long-standing interest in and complicated relationship with the notion of performance, I was excited when I was able to register for this class as I was preparing for my first semester in Penn's Master of Environmental Studies program. Admittedly, I took this course purely for personal reasons, as the subject matter didn't explicitly relate to my interests in degrowth and technology. Instead, I saw that this class would be a great opportunity to explore a theoretical framework that had compelled me for years for both intellectual and deeply personal reasons. In other words, I thought that this class would be some great therapy through theory. In all honesty, though, towards the beginning of the semester, the looming final research project was a source of anxiety. Having been trained primarily as an artist during my undergraduate studies, I had no prior experience with academic research. Sure, I had no problem putting together a final paper in which I could simply construct an argument via pre-existing literature, but the realm of conducting novel research using established methods was unfamiliar territory. Indeed, even my honors thesis, in which I argued that social media perpetuates anthropocentrism, was more of a philosophical musing by way of a literature review. It wasn't until the fourth week of classes that I became more sure of my abilities to tackle the final project. After finishing the assigned reading of Norman Denzin's call to, quote, explore performance autoethnography as a vehicle for enacting a performative cultural politics of hope, end quote, I realized that a performative autoethnography would be an apt method for me to utilize in my final project, given my background. Which is why I'm talking to my laptop right now. And in true scholarly form, I'll now discuss the methodology of this project in more depth. As Holman Jones, Adams, and Ellis write in the introduction to the Handbook of Autoethnography, autoethnography creates a space for a turn, a change, a reconsideration of how we think, how we do research and relationships, and how we live. One characteristic that binds all autoethnographies is the use of personal experience to examine and/or critique cultural experience. LaRue echoes this understanding of autoethnography in her review of the literature about the methodology. She writes that autoethnography offers a way of giving voice to personal experience for the purpose of extending sociological understanding, and consequently provides opportunities to help people interrogate and challenge aspects of the worlds and themselves in these worlds, and to work towards reshaping these worlds, often in the interest of social justice. She goes on to explain that autoethnographies can be understood as existing on a spectrum. On one side stands analytic autoethnographies, which, quote, use empirical data to gain insight into and develop a theoretical understanding of a broader set of social phenomena, end quote. This genre of autoethnography is, quote, consequently directed towards objective writing and analysis, end quote. On the other side sits evocative autoethnographies, which, quote, evoke emotional resonance through artfully braided evocative text, end quote. These autoethnographies lean towards, quote, research introspection from which readers are expected to make a connection with the researcher's emotions and experiences, end quote. This research project will attempt to weave together elements of both analytic and evocative autoethnographies. Through the autoethnographic process, I wish to explore this project's central research question. As the second decade of the 21st century begins on planet Earth, what does it mean to align myself with the notions of degrowth and socioecological liberation, while also living in the imperial core of the United States of America? In other words, amidst the sociological instability of contemporary times, how do I grapple with my identities as a degrowther and an American citizen? To help me unpack this question, I will draw upon the notions of identity and identity crisis. And while I know that within academia, identity can be an infinitely fickle concept, I'll be using the term to broadly refer to my own understanding of myself and myself in relation to the world around me. To discuss the concept of an identity crisis, I'll draw upon Baumeister et al., who present the concept of a legitimation crisis, or an identity conflict. This type of identity crisis emerges when two or more core aspects of a person enter into conflict with one another, thus producing internal dissonance. And to understand how an identity crisis plays out, I'll utilize Clarke's discussion and McFarlane's extension of Victor Turner's understanding of social drama. And let the convoluted nature of that last bit serve as commentary on how meaning can be reinterpreted and even lost as scholars move farther and farther away from the source material, myself included. Bits aside, Clarke utilizes theatrical concepts in order to understand collective action as social drama, composed of moments of breach, crisis, and reintegration, a beginning, middle, and end. In the case of this project, I'll be using these dramatic stages as a means of framing moments of epiphany in my life that have shaped me into who I am today. In other words, I'll be using the cycle of breach, crisis, and reintegration in order to unpack and grapple with my identity as an American degrowther in 2020. But first, in line with the reflexivity characteristic of autoethnography, I'll now locate my current social position. Born on the cusp between millennials and Generation Z, I'm a cis, queer, able-bodied man of Filipino descent racialized as brown, living in Houston, Texas on stolen Sana and Karankawa land. The son of two immigrants, I grew up experiencing a fair amount of socioeconomic privilege, something I continue to experience as I pursue the Master of Environmental Studies at the University of Pennsylvania. Within the MES program, I'm driven to explore the relationship between degrowth and social media in order to design more convivial forms of social networking. But what led me to degrowth in the first place? Watch and find out!
What was that? Why am I so stressed? Oh, I'm just thinking about all of the work I have to do for my Ivy League graduate program. But I guess that's just the cost of being a scholar in training. Still, you wouldn't understand how hard it is to be a graduate student at an Ivy League university. Especially during a pandemic. I was supposed to be walking the hallowed halls of the University of Pennsylvania. No, not Pennsylvania State University. I mean the Ivy League institution that is known as the University of Pennsylvania.
Letters to a Mirror by Kyle Legacy. Grief fills the room up of my absent child, leaving me to mourn the death of myself. Burning and drowned, the charred skeleton meets the sunken ghost, and billions of lives, both aflame and aflood, are torn asunder in the absence of myself. It's easy to cry. It's easy to exhume the corpses of past selves, to beat those dead horses, and to beat yourself. It's harder to breathe, to go, to sit in the uncomfortable present, the unbearable no. Hardest still to swallow, but acknowledge your tears. So, sigh the sorrow, weep the willow, but find comfort in its shadow. For you must continue to live for those lives gone by feeling the earth uplift your feet, and by feeling the wind caress your skin, and by feeling the warmth of your beautiful smile. The child, my child, my child, my child. Mwah. To understand what brought me to degrowth, we first have to go back in time to fall 2017, when I wrote that poem. At the time, I was beginning my third year at the University of Minnesota Guthrie Theatre BFA Actor Training Program, where we spent the first semester of junior year studying abroad in London at Shakespeare's Globe. This is a picture of me at Shakespeare's Globe. And not to be all, studying abroad changed my life, but studying abroad changed my life. This was because being abroad breached my understanding of my own identity. Having spent the past 2 years as a queer brown man in the Midwest, it was easy for me to feel marginalized. But then, when I was in London, I realized that I was an American student studying acting at Shakespeare's Globe in London on my parents' money. That's when I realized my life wasn't that bad. To understand what brought me to... But the breach that set my identity off into full-blown crisis mode was the fact that while I was in London, Hurricane Harvey was devastating Houston, and the North Bay fires were ripping through Northern California. I remember sitting in my flat, thousands of miles away from these places I called home, hearing about the evacuation of my childhood neighborhood, anxiously texting my parents to make sure they weren't flooded out, feeling completely unable to help my besieged communities, and then walking to class the next day to talk about Shakespeare. As you can imagine, there was a lot of conflict going on inside me. I was already questioning if I even wanted to pursue an acting career, and being forced to confront the reality of the climate crisis compelled me to learn more about what I could do in the face of ecological breakdown. So, in between learning my lines for Titus Andronicus, and in an attempt to reintegrate myself amidst the internal conflict I was experiencing, I did some research and found out that my university offered a minor in sustainability studies. Thus, at the end of the semester, I declared the minor, motivated to finish it in the remaining 3 semesters of undergrad. But dear viewer, those last 3 semesters were not easy. The BFA program was already incredibly time-consuming, so trying to juggle rehearsals 6 days a week, and a full course load, and a part-time job with this new minor was not a good time. All the while, my mental health was rapidly deteriorating. I mentioned before that I wasn't interested in pursuing an acting career, and that's because being trained as a performer completely warped my understanding of social interaction. And here's a self-portrait I made during that time in my life. It's mental illness, love. I started suffering from pathological levels of dissociation, something that psychological research suggests is common in acting students. So although declaring this new minor was an attempt at identity reintegration, I was still in full-blown crisis. Even so, the time I was spending in my minor, I was absolutely loving, and it led me to do some really cool things. Like interning in DC and helping pass one of the nation's strongest renewable portfolio standards, TAing for the required introductory course for the minor and a course on the global food system, making video content on environmental issues and being featured in an art festival on campus, and going to Germany to learn more about renewable energy transitions. In an attempt to reintegrate the artistic side of myself with a part of me that's passionate about ecological regeneration, I applied to an interdisciplinary and very selective graduate program, and then got rejected. This was less of an informed graduate application and more of a coping mechanism to deal with the hell that was my senior year of school. Still, I managed to graduate in one piece, shouts out to my family, and then subsequently went on tour? I know, very ironic that my first gig out of school was a theater gig, but the tour I was a part of was an outdoor walking play about Ralph Waldo Emerson and Henry David Thoreau and their mutual love for nature. This is the part of the show where I got to pull a cart, and then I also got to scream at the audience, and it was a lot of fun. Touring ended up being a lovely experience where I visited some absolutely beautiful places in the Midwest. It also helped me process the trauma of attending acting school for 4 years. And also after graduating, I gave a TEDx talk on my honors thesis, so that was pretty cool. Still passionate about working towards socioecological liberation, and mindful that I knew I wanted to pursue further studies, I moved back in with my parents after the tour and applied to grad school for the second time. Which is what brings me here today! What does this have to do with degrowth? How did your identity crisis resolve into a moment of integration? Why are there 3 Ks in American in the title of this project? Don't worry! I'll get to it. Hopefully. Am I falling in love or just falling apart? Oh, sometimes I feel like we're not meant to be, but I know I'm wrong. I wish I knew what it was. I wish I could shut it up. Am I falling in love or just... Am I falling in love or just... Hold me close. Preface for this next section. Sometimes my sweater becomes muted and sometimes it's really bright and vibrant because of my camera's phone. Why? I don't know. Why? I don't know. Going back to the questions I posed, I talked about my life story since 2017 as a means of illustrating how being confronted with both the great deal of privilege I have and the grim reality of the climate crisis led me to commit myself to learn more about the ecological and work towards ecological regeneration. This commitment brought me to Penn, where I was initially interested in exploring how to merge concepts from both environmental policy and communication and media policy in order to create more ecologically conscious media systems at the federal level. However, a chance encounter with degrowth last spring on Twitter, funnily enough, challenged me to consider if I was actually interested in trying to affect change via a top-down approach within the federal political realm. You know, a system with a stellar reputation of doing any long-term good. Thus, a mini breach ensued. To use language from sociologist Eric Olin Wright, the side of me that was motivated to tame the systems that perpetuated ecocide lost footing against the sides of me compelled to erode these systems. In other words, I became more interested in grassroots approaches that took a bottom-up angle to dismantling the systems that perpetuate ecological breakdown. And not to say that taming isn't a part of degrowth strategies, as there are plenty of degrowthers out there who advocate for top-down policies, like a Green New Deal without growth or a minimum and maximum income. But the point is that coming across degrowth cemented in me that I was no longer interested in working in Washington, D.C. Interested in learning more about degrowth, I virtually attended the 2020 Degrowth Conference in Vienna, which was right at the same time as when the summer uprisings against systemic and violent anti-blackness started. I remember getting up at 3 a.m. to attend the first morning session of the conference, and seeing that my Twitter feed was flooded with pictures and videos from the protests in Minneapolis after the murder of George Floyd. I also remember feeling shame for indulging myself in this intellectual space while people were literally being assaulted in the streets by police for taking a stand against anti-blackness. And I also remember feeling disgusted with myself, as I was forced to confront the anti-blackness harbored within me as a result of being socialized as a non-black person in the anti-black, white supremacist, cis-heteropatriarchal, capitalistic, extractivist, settler colonial project that is the United States of America. Thus bringing us to the topic of why I spell American with 3 Ks in the title of this project. I do so as a means of highlighting the putrid foundation upon which this country was built, and as a means of acknowledging my own complicity in perpetuating and benefiting from these systems. My understanding of America's immense history of and capacity for harm emerged from the seeds that were planted during my semester in London, when my understanding of myself as an American citizen was initially breached. Confronting the relative privilege I had as an American paved the way for a deeper understanding of this country's destructive imperialistic history. Other breaches in my understanding of my American identity include learning about the post-World War II Green Revolution, in which America exported industrial agricultural techniques across the globe under the guise of humanitarian aid that decimated crop biodiversity and agroecological integrity, or the American colonization of the Philippines from the turn of the 20th century to World War II, in which Filipino and Filipinx people became subject to the same invocation of savagery US leaders used to justify the dehumanization and violent treatment of anyone who isn't white and wealthy. And I'm ashamed to say that I only gained a more embodied sense of America's true nature through academic texts I've read as a young adult. But I guess that just speaks to the power of growing up in early 21st century America, where I was socialized into thinking that bombing innocent brown people was perfectly justifiable. It's mental illness, love. And when confronted with the brazen display of violent force this country will employ in order to maintain the racial arrangements of white supremacy and anti-blackness that re-erupted this past summer, that was the proverbial straw that initiated the crisis in which I am still trying to make sense of what it means to be an American. On top of that, I'm willingly attending the University of Pennsylvania, an institution with its own nefarious history of feeding the climate crisis, the police-industrial complex, and other systems of harm. So, who am I to stand on my video's soapbox and decry these paradigms of oppression while still holding an American passport and pursuing an Ivy League degree? Who am I to talk about liberation in the face of systems and structures that are too immense, too complex, too grave for me to truly understand? For example, at the time of this project's filming, some current events include talks about a second pandemic stimulus check amounting to $600 while socioeconomic elites get first-in-line treatment to the newly released vaccines, or the SolarWinds hack in which the networks of a plethora of corporations and high-level government agencies, including the National Nuclear Security Administration, were compromised in arguably the largest act of cyber espionage ever, and, of course, the continued collapse of planetary systems with the hottest November on record due to human activity coming and going. In the face of this uncomfortable present, this unbearable now, degrowth stands as a grounding framework that outlines a pluriverse of alternative paths that lead to futures in which we can collectively reimagine what it means to live a good life. A movement of movements centered around care, autonomy, and socio-ecological transformations that I became compelled to walk alongside after the Vienna conference. Since the conference, I dove into the worlds of degrowth, finding myself joining the editorial team over at degrowth.info, an international group of lovely and inspiring people who work towards uplifting degrowth voices and stories. I started conversations everywhere I could at Penn about degrowth, from posting on Canvas discussion boards, giving a talk at Penn's Climate Week, and facilitating a panel discussion through my program's graduate board. And I've begun to tap into the degrowth movement here in the States, meeting other like-minded people who are just as impassioned to struggle towards socio-ecological liberation, while also living in the imperial core, the belly of the American beast. Thus, committing myself to degrowth has been a reintegrative journey in which I continue to resolve these crises within me that were set off by those initial breaches in London. So, to return to the question of what it means to be an American degrowther in 2020 and beyond, I think it entails a number of things. It means accepting the grave and indeed scary social, historical, and ecological realities of contemporary times, and still choosing to commit myself to the notions of justice and regeneration. It means continually challenging my own place within matrices of harm, and understanding that learning and unlearning are difficult processes that nevertheless must be pursued. And it means knowing that I can wake up each day and set the intention to struggle alongside those who pursue the co-creation of a plurality of worlds that cultivate respectful, loving, and caring ways of life. It also means connecting with the land around me, settler that I am, and marveling at the elder live oaks, dancing with the mycelial network, and appreciating the lives of myself and those around me. And ultimately, it means finding the resolve, even in the face of trials I cannot yet fathom, to always take the next step towards better futures for all.
Drink it now, guys, these days it keeps growing, and we might never get out. Besides, we're not even moving, we're just standing around. But I must admit that when it comes to this, I'm as scared as the rest. Feels like something's hunting me down. It'll end up to be like those films that you see where they